Okay, then we are going to start the third session and the final session of this day. And for this session, we have Dr. Devopriya Pal. He is assistant professor in the Department of English, Calcutta University. And I was Sir's student when he was in the University of Borbongo. So it's really very nice to welcome you, sir. And for this session, we have 5 participants. And to begin with, we have Sara Bushra. Sara Bushra is is a research candidate at the Department of English of Aligarh Muslim University, and the title of her today's paper is Revisiting and Decrypting the Indian Men of. I request Sara to begin the lecture.
Hello and good evening, everyone. My name is Sara Bushra and I belong to as a research candidate at English Department of Aligarh Muslim University. The title of my paper is Revisiting and Decrypting the Indian Men of Jhumpa Lahiri. This paper aims to follow the guidelines of post-colonialism and gender associated with the work of American writer and novelist Jhumpa Lahiri. Lahiri has been known for her work dealing with Bengali characters in the American setting from the onset of independent India. Her works has been turned into critical essays and critically acclaimed motion picture. Jhumpa Lahiri's fiction, the two fiction that I'm going to use in this paper, The Lowland and The Unaccustomed Earth, represent the dogma attached with the nativity within a man. The literature available in the aforementioned title will project the menism in contrast to the widely discussed feminism of her work. Menism intends to bring forth the psychological and emotional dilemma it takes to be a man in a foreign land. The paper, furthermore, will stimulate the post-colonial hybridity of Homi Ke Bhaba and trace the history of Indian works in English to put forth into view the clarity needed for the men of Lahiri's world. For a very long time, we have bound ourselves under the superficial correlation between discussion of gender and feminism. The fruits of gender discussion highlights negative patriarchy, masculinity, and feminism. The idea of menism seems almost lost. The prevalence of matriarchy in the feminist world pertaining to everything that a woman is supposed to be equal and identical in connection with the men that they attain and achieve. The feminist world has rendered the so-called stronger section of the society voiceless in context that their mental health, their emotional trauma, their emotional dilemma at any point of their lives are rarely discussed. The post-colonial literature deals with the idea and sense of identity on a wide scale. The 3 phases of it, adopt, adapt, and adapt, decipher the kind and level of literature in question. While the initial, that is, adopt, recognizes with the universality, second phase adheres to the recognition of nativity, and third pushes the revolution into motion for the safeguard of lost nativity and the adaptation of universality. The nation question is an important part of the recent post-colonial studies as people have migrated to other lands in search of higher education and better employment. Colonization, an act of forming colonies, brought forward the shift from the natives to the intruders, thus relocating the sense of identity. The natives lost their idea of belongingness to the nation they were in and wanted to be recognized to the natives with the colonizers, with the standards of the colonizers. But that occurred when they emphasized their national identity through recognition of suppression and revolt against it. Moreover, the sense of belongingness deviates on several grounds, from education to the luxurious standards of living. But to portray such deviation, one needs a platform with which the coming of English in the form of higher education available for the upper middle class and upper classes of the country made possible. When we look at the Indian history, it was once the land of spices and snake charmers. That's what the colonizers or the intruders actually attained as the idea of a country. But in fact, it was and still remains a land of diverse culture, which was in past and still trying to live in peace and harmony, till they were offered a way to progress their trial of living in a different fashion. This era of new governors and governance brought out different set of possible growths for the natives. One of them was education, which was different from traditional approach, which was basically based on their religion. People now were able to attain primary education where they learn different subjects, and who attained and were able to achieve such education were beginning to be considered inferior, superior in contrast to the people who were unable to attain it. When the British government introduced English as part of their higher education program, rendering yet another blow to the unity amongst the natives. While some saw this as an opportunity to enhance and practice their superiority over the less privileged, others started to see this as an opportunity to present their country in the language of their rulers. Native language literature, despite the fact that it was readily available, people were unable to read them because of their different languages they were written in. They did not have a common language. That was in the initial first half of 20th century, that is till 1925. The table turnover came around 1930s when literature bloomed due to revolution against the rulers. The fire of freedom which was ablaze in the country gave the Indian natives the resources of their colonizers to showcase their revolution. Although the initial attempts to write the novels in English were vague and failures, they still did not stop them from attempting it and writing their heart and mind out. And it was not just the men who wrote, but also the women. Even way before these revolutionary writers picked their ink to stain the minds of literates with their amazing provocative imagination from across the country, Bengal was already playing to the tunes of progressive literature way beyond it. The Dutt brothers, Kailash Chandra Dutt and Shashi Chandra Dutt, were the two brothers who wrote literature pertaining to the future. The imaginary literature wrote by Kailash Chandra Dutt, a journal of 48 hours of 1945, was actually written in 1835, a decade and 2 years prior to the idea that he was trying to focus. He almost hit the mark of this imaginary future which was fighting for the freedom of the country. Nevertheless, when we pick the history of English novels in India, we find the Dutt brothers as its harbingers. Then the bigger names follow, which are more famous than the Dutt brothers, like Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, Gurubabai Satyanandan, Fakir Mohan, Senapati, and Premchand. Novels by Chattopadhyay were mainly of Bengali dialect, except for one, that is Rajamohan's Wife, which did not give him that much popularity because of his sudden shift to his native language. This shift is actually a fact that this was the time when he realized that the native language was taking a back seat because of the prevalence of English language and readers trying to, there was a lack of readers in the upcoming language, that is English. There were still readers who were available in the native language and they wanted it in that particular language. So Chattopadhyay shifted from English to Bengali and is still famous for that. During the colonial time period, English was a language in demand which gave the native mother tongue a backseat for a while. This projection of nationality under the foreign language presented the readers with a different perspective and a dilemma. The two facts were whether or not to accept the language as their own to understand the still literature in which these writers were trying to portray their country in a colonizer's language, and second, whether or not to accept the authors who presented them with such literature. The second problem was a bigger one pertaining to the first one because these writers who wrote in English had similar education as to their colonizers, as to their rulers. That meant they had access to same kind of literature, that is Byron, Shakespeare, Cooper, Coleridge, and others. Bengal has always been known for its literature and thirst for knowledge and progress. Its aim has been to move forward with the ever-changing times, and it has successfully done so. While the colonial time period saw the adapt of post-colonialism in the face of language adaptation, post-freedom, it presented the adopt where people not only went forth with the education system that was available in the country, but also diverged in living standards cultivated by it. Here is where the men of that time period come in. It was initially the matter of pride for men to go out and work while women took care of the household. But with changing times, the women were actually expected to be involved in the household to such an extent that they maintain their household standards in relation to the standards of the society. That is, they match the ever growing cultivation of high luxurious standards. These men did not think of the women of their house or the women of the country as a burden, but they thought it as their duty to these women who were the equal partakers of the developing country. Their mind were educated, these women's mind were educated with almost equal opportunities in the beginning of the post-independence era, that the men handed down the adopted techniques, that is education, to these women. The education was the main idea that they offered, cutting down the pride and the ego. These were the Indian woke men of the developing times who were able to invest in the educated women psychologically and socially. But still, there was a portion that held the hand of these women. The, this was the patriarchy that prevailed in the society, that the Indian women were able to adjust in the Indian society while they were in India quite easily, but their personalities were unable to adjust when they shifted abroad. This is clearly available in the novel written by a Bengali writer, Bharati Mukherjee. Novel titled is Wife. It was written in 1975. Although it is a feminist text that talks about cultural alienation, location shift, identity crisis, it also highlights the delusional tendencies, the location shift, and inability to settle down in a different culture brings out in the lead character Dimple Das Gupta, which ultimately lead her to stab her husband Amit Basu. Mukherjee's point was feminist, but the man cannot be ignored. Man, Amit carried the responsibility of breadwinning, and a change brought a hard blow on him when he too faced the identity crisis. Dimple might have been the Bengali housewife entitled to do everything for him, but he was supposed to keep his head high as an Indian, a Bengali, and a bread earner in America all at the same time. His attempts to balance the native identity with the American identity amongst his friends and colleagues does not do him good. He loses his job, and when that happens, it causes him a mental trauma and forcing him into neglect of his childish wife, and hence spiraling the life out of his hand. But this was one Bengali writer, one Bengali woman talking about the first generation of Indians in America, and that too in the fourth quarter of 20th century. This is the time where there is a development in migration, post-independence, of men taking a leap for their job or for higher education. But the conundrum of 21st century's first or second generation of Indian men in a foreign land can be theorized, has been theorized, and can be located in the theory of post-colonial idea of hybridity, the concept given by Homi K. Bhabha, which signifies the mixing of personal nativity with the land of migration. Bhabha's hybridity has a multicultural tone to it as he colored the colonial text in cross-cultural linkage. It is different from his idea of mimicry, which he says to be similar and yet different from hybridity. Mimicry provided the colonial power the presence it needed in order for the colonized to be represented. But hybridity has a words of it. It caters to the demands of man's native identity through his own expression, which he himself impresses upon others without any help. It might be the language he borrows, but the idea and feelings, the experience and method remains his own. There are several writers who have given voice to different theories, one of whom is Jhumpa Lahiri, the Pulitzer Prize winner American author with roots in West Bengal. Although born to immigrant parents in London and brought up in America, she is a second generation child to the first generation immigrants. Her parents did fill her with the heritage which she thus carries in every work. Her language is simple and is readily available for the readers to grasp the dilemma, the turmoil, and other complex emotions emitted by her characters. When asked about her sudden need to migrate and her ever-reading presence of Ovid, she has said, a sense of frustration, of dissatisfaction. I used to look for an identity that could be sharp, acceptable, mine. But now the idea of a precise identity seems a trap, and I prefer an overabundant one. the Italian piece, the Brooklyn one, the Indian one. Identity is a completely fluid thing, and metamorphosis has its concept in it. She is right, and she sticks to her word in both of her works titled the first work, The Lowland, which is a postmodernist where she has done a postmodernist job in a post-colonial era by bringing the flashbacks, by connecting the now of one place to now of another. The two brothers, Subhash and Udyan, living on the outskirts of Calcutta, their location have an impact on them, and it impacts both of them differently. While Udyan wants to stay back and work for his fellow countrymen, Subhash wants to go abroad to pursue higher education. Both of them get their wishes done, but it creates a burden, an immense one, on the shoulder. Subhash becomes an immigrant native of Rhode Island, pursuing PhD, having a different life from Indian brother Udin. Sudden demise of his brother, suddenly taking his brother's widow as his wife and taking in all the child, creates a rift in his normal, everyday, ongoing. He becomes an emotionally independent man. He turns, he turns from an emotionally independent man to someone who has to cater his need to belong to the native identity of being a father, as an Indian father who keeps the entire family together, and also as an American father by giving his child the freedom the American parents give. The anxiety of being a father to a child who is oblivious to her ancestral connections with a wife who refuses to settle to this new change unsettles him. His attempts to connect his parents with their only grandchild is to find a similar homely ground which he has lost in the foreign land. The responsibility, which was supposed to be shared by two people, became a burden for him, leading him with consistent anger and detachment from his marital life. His inclination towards fulfilling his duties as a parent by keeping a steady job and also his child's biological reality, a secret from her, tires him and him alone. Then another work of Lahiri, that is Unaccustomed Earth, which is a short story collection of several Bengali families roaming around America for their livelihood, has a groundbreaking reality of Indian identity within a community which is foreign in
You
a
are not
foreign land.
audible. Kindly check your network connection.
Oh, this-
Sarah, you are not audible. Check your network connection.
so I'm not audible at all. अरे यार, पूरा तो paper ही है. Sir, I'm not audible at all.
Okay, I can hear you. For me,
So
your
from
voice is
where
coming
do I
clear.
need to start again?
No, I have heard as long as you have already read or said.
Okay, then I'll continue.
You better continue, I think, from the point of unaccustomed dust.
Okay. So it's a collection of short stories of several Bengali families roaming America for their livelihood, which has a groundbreaking reality of Indian identity. There is a network issue with Bhaskar sir's end because I can hear him,
Sir, she
you
is
can hear
not
me.
responding. So we should we move to the next paper presenter?
No, I can hear her loud and clear. Bhaskar, can you hear me? Bhaskar, are you on the
So,
call?
it's from Bhaskar sir's end actually, I guess.
Maybe. So the virtual platform cannot actually be the match for
Yes,
the
sir.
actual platform.
Yes, sir.
Bhaskar,
Sir, she is not present. She is not responding. So shall
no,
we?
I can hear her clear enough. Can you hear me, Bhaskar? আমাকে শুনতে পাচ্ছো? ভাস্কর, Bhaskar, are you online?
Yes, sir. He will come online. I've informed him that you can hear me.
Okay.
Okay, so the first story is about Ruma and her father. In the story Unaccustomed Earth, we find her as a second generation child born in America, married to an American with a hybrid offspring. The story is more about the father and his grandson than about Ruma. The hybrid of a cross cultural marriage, her son Akash would have leaned towards his grandfather. The bond could have created a different passage for the heritage to be carried over, only if he himself hadn't been the Indian father who doesn't live with his daughter and his son-in-law. In the story Hell Heaven, we have Pranab Chakrabarti and his connections with other Bengali families in America. He's there to study and falls in love with a woman named Deborah, whom he marries and divorces after two kids, 14 years later to his marriage because he is straight from. The party the narrator Usha attends at Pranab's place is full of Bengali families. This presence of Bengali families and the divorce that follows with another marriage in tow is a clear expression of his attachment to his homeland. The second homeland does belong to him in the sense that he has the courage to divorce his wife for another woman, which cannot be easily practiced in India. The fact that this woman is Indian provides another proof that he carried the identity all along within him, which rendered his path back where his parents wanted. That is, they wanted him to marry a Bengali Indian woman, though not in the exact manner and conduct. Deborah was a dutiful wife to him, but he was unsatisfied because deep in his heart, he wanted someone with whom he could share his memories of his homeland as mutual, and he found one just a little too late in normal circumstances. The second part of this collection, titled Hema and Kaushik, speaks largely about the second generation Bengali children growing up in America with parents Indian at heart. Kaushik is a second generation child who then immigrates, leaving traces of adjustment issues. His father's second marriage leaves him disturbed. Yet, as an Indian son, he dutifully obeys his father and tries to accept his new phase. The struggle grows ever more when he finds his stepsisters going through his mother's pictures and becomes defensive of her position in the family despite the fact that she is deceased. While the basic concept of new parent adjustments are different for every country and culture, Kaushik's upbringing did not alter his Indianness. Even though he was raised pretty much in an elite surrounding where disregard for parents and their lineage was an acceptance, he was drowning in his love for his biological parent altogether. There's a breakthrough from Indian culture when he sleeps with Hema. He has an unsettling nature. He's a free will man who does not want to get a firm ground of familiar ties and is sure of himself. No matter his love for Hema, who is ready to give up on her marriage for him, he refuses her on the grounds where he doesn't want any arrangements between them. No marriage and nothing else either. This is the shift from original Indianness, the evidence of being a product of influence of multiculturalism. Hema confesses to herself that her refusal of his proposal is based on the ground of no marriage idea and no marriage proposal from his side. He remains stubborn to his forward. In the end, I would like to say that these Indian men of Jhumpaleri are men who converse with changing times. Indians change when they are abroad and yet try to stick with their homeland. They carry their identity within themselves, which resurface every now and then. For Pranab, it was the second marriage that brought out the connection he had lost with his homeland in the second home. For Kaushik, it was resurfacing of his neglected childhood interest in Hema. They keep on running back to the hidden native identity. While the feminists have focused on how these men ruined the lives of women in the story, which is absolutely true, they have surely neglected the menist aspect which enhances and clearly takes stand for the native identity which they carry beneath the calm, disinterested, and forward attitude. Men have a lot to burden themselves with: career, family, independent identity, and a native identity in a foreign land. Their minds and their actions are the hybrid of their surrounding culture. They want to be recognized on both the fronts. No matter which generation they are, nativity is an integral part of their personality. It supports them, it devours them, but in the end, they belong to it and it belongs to them. Hybridity sure does take effect on their behavior and cognition for a while, leaving them with a mental and emotional dilemma, but they still emerge victorious, as seen in the incidents of Pranam. Also, when we look at Ruma's father's decision to roam the world with another Bengali woman, a widower like him, we come to an understanding that hybridity in belief and acceptance leads to formation of new friendships engulfed in the guards of native familiarity. Thank you.
Sir, you can ask question, and I also request the viewer who are watching us on YouTube, if they have any questions regarding this lecture, then they can write in the chat box, and we will certainly pass them to the paper presenter. And sir, now you can begin if you have any question.
Zara, first, I would like to thank you for paying so much attention on men in talking about the gender issues. So they are a bit neglected, as you have rightly pointed out in the studies of gender. I am particularly curious to know about one thing, that the term that you have used throughout, that is menism. Does it
Yes,
have any theoretical history of its own, or is it your coinage?
no, sir, it doesn't have any coining before I did that, because obviously we don't have an idea pertaining into contrast with the feminism everywhere, as pointed out that men are neglected. So this was my own idea. I haven't found any literature available in menism yet.
I think you should try a little bit of Judith Butler and the Gender Trouble and
Yes,
Performing Gender. These sorts of books which have actually ushered this, what is called the domain of gender studies, in a very big way, and it is very much now a kind of a level playing field between the men and women being equally treated, or rather, the question of gender treated beyond the identities of men and women.
yes.
And the other thing that I am particularly interested to know is that since you have concentrated on Jhumpale's fiction, which actually talks about the diasporic Bengali families, do you think that in a way it somehow is capable of generalizing the feelings and the emotions about the Indians in general, or is it something that's culturally specific even in its diasporic identity? Uh,
Must if I have to agree with, I would be more going with the in-depth cultural ideology, because that is what in her every work we have found this. The Lahari literature is actually pertaining to the culture that her parents gave her. So that would
So
be,
in that, there is a very strong Bengali undertone. This is what I just like to
yes.
mention, that and being a Bengali, being a diasporic Bengali, can it be generalized in the sense of being a diasporic Indian? Say how far it is reflecting of, say, diasporic Gujarati experience of modernity, of the men-women relationship.
So
Something like,
obviously,
okay,
if we move
you can give
away
it a thought
from
later.
non-Bengali, or if we move it across the entire country, and when we go out abroad, we can find similar kind of community division.
Mhm.
So that would become that it won't just pertain to Bengal. She has taken her
Mhm.
native identity, but when we put the same literature, if we just change the location and the language of the people, but and when we take it abroad, we will easily be able to spot a community division, a Bengali division, a
Oh,
Gujarati or a Marathi. There is a lot of division all across the world, but when they all come together, it's just the Indian community that would be highlighted over
okay, Sarah, I like your presentation. So, are there any more questions, Bhaskar, Sarah, or should we move on to the next presenter?
No, sir, there is no question. So I think we should move to our next paper presenter.
there. Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you, Shara, for
Okay,
your nice
thank you, Sarah.
presentation.
Thank you, sir.
Mm.
And for the next paper presenter, we have Benedict Di Sangma. She is an independent scholar, and she's working as an assistant teacher in a school. And the title of her research paper is "Colonialism and Gender Oppression and Racism: A Post-Colonial Reading of Alice Walker's novel The Color Purple." So, Benedict Di Sangma, it's to you. You can begin your uh, paper.
Hello?
Yes, you are perfectly audible. You can
Okay,
begin your
so
You
presentation.
can start. Okay, I can hear you.
okay.
Okay.
Good evening to all. First of all, I would like to extend my gratitude to the head of the Department of English, Sir Bhaskar, for giving me this opportunity to present my paper. Respected Chairperson, Sir, and all the participants, the title of my paper is Colonialism, Gender Oppression, and Racism, a post-colonial reading of Alice Walker's novel, The Color Purple. My paper is an attempt to study Alice Walker's novel, The Color Purple, with a backdrop of post-colonial literary theory in order to understand the hidden structures of language that are involved in post-colonial discourses. The Color Purple is an epistolary novel which won the 1983 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. Set in the deep American South between the wars, The Color Purple is a classic tale of Sally, a young black girl born into poverty, and her gradual discovery of power and joy of her own spirit, freeing herself from the past and uniting her with those she loves. Her deepest hopes are realized with the help from her lovely community of women, including her husband's lover shark Avery and her sister Nettie. It is a story about the layers of discrimination and prejudice that surround us, white against black, black against black, and man against woman. The novelist deals holistically with the fate of African Americans from the perspective of Africa and the tribes who sold their kinsmen to white slavers, the devastation of Africa by European colonizers, particularly after the First World War, leading to the Second World War. The violence in the South, particularly aimed towards women, female sexuality. Alice Walker talks about the tough condition, persecution, and the ultimate redemption of the African colonized people in The Color Purple. Post-colonialism is an important concept in the field of literary criticism today. It provides an outlet to discuss various experiences from the colonial period, like racism, cultural dominance, quest for identity, slavery, resistance, gender, etc., to the influential discourses of imperial Europe. Post-colonial has become a convenient term to describe any kind of resistance, particularly against class, race, and gender oppression. The term post-colonial draws support for its usefulness as an umbrella term, a way of bracketing together literature written in those countries which were once colonies of Britain. The post-colonial African literature emerged in its present form out of the experience of colonization and aims at re-examining the history and legacy of colonialism and incorporating the perspectives of the colonized. Half has never been told. Post-colonialism thus refers to both an era after colonialism and to a set of critical attitudes taken towards it. It is the discourse of opportunity which colonialism brings into being, and post-colonial African literature critically scrutinizes the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. This post-colonialism has been rightly defined as a world as it exists during and after the period of European imperial domination and the effects of this contemporary literature. African writing in English has established its presence and reputation in the last quarter of the 20th century. The corpus of African writing constitutes a very significant part of the post-colonial literary discourse. The social, cultural, and political changes to which Africa had been subjected since colonization find expression in the contemporary African fiction. The frustration and despair of Africans after independence, when the indigenous rulers appeared in black skin, white masks, and other problematic issues related to erstwhile colonized natives, form a significant part of post-colonial African writings. The African culture is similarly defended by Franz Fanon in his Wretch of the Earth, where he explores the characteristics of colonial power and its impact on Africans. Colonialist forces rendered the Africans marginalized, dispossessed, subjected within their own land. This marginalization of Africans is also pointed out by Edward Said, who posits that there has been a massive intellectual and moral and imaginative overhaul and deconstruction of Western representation of the non-Western. Apart from such renowned African critics, quite few other post-colonial African writers have also offered a socio-cultural and political critique of Africa in their fiction. African post-independent fiction offers a critique of colonial power by writing back to the empire. Post-colonial literature has been driven by the need to resist colonial intervention, a position reiterated by the phrase writing back, which has been integral to the notion of post-colonial African writing. African writers such as Chinua Achebe and Gungi wa Thiong'o have not only enriched the African literary discourse, but imparted new insights and dimensions to the post-colonial literary discourse. Colonialism in the color purple. The influence and the impact of colonialism is well illustrated by Alice Walker in her novel The Color Purple. The English rubber planters not only destroyed the yam crops, but had also demolished the roof leaf of the Olinka tribe, which they worship and use it to shelter their homes. This left them with no options but to flee in the jungle to take refuge. The Color Purple is replete with examples of power relations between the colonial empires and the colonial subjects, white people ill-treating the black or man abusing the women. The abuse yielded by black or white characters underpins nearly all the interpersonal conflict in the story. It is clearly evident as Albert tries to show his dominance over his children and wives. Even Alfonso experiences complete control as an abusive and violent father. Samuel and Corinth, as representatives of a colonial system, attempts to impose a European ideology to control the lives and beliefs of the Olinka people. As white upper-class people in a world order and that privileges them over those who are black or poor, Miss Millie, Eleanor Jean, and Doris Bynes exert control over both African Americans and Africans. I quote, "Why us always have family reunions on 4th July, say Henrietta, mouth poked out, full of complaint, it's so hot. White people busy celebrating their independence from England July 4th, say Harpo. So most black folks don't have to work. Us can spend the day celebrating each other." Here, the colonial and imperial past of the United States is clearly addressed at the end of the novel, when Sally's extended family is reunited on July the 4th, which is a national holiday to celebrate American independence. Harpo, a descendant of slaves, sees little significance in a celebration that has nothing to do with freedom of black man, but is concerned only with white men's struggle for political control of a newly colonized continent. Gender oppression and resistance in the novel. Gender inequality and sexual discrimination form the backdrop of all the female characters' lives. Gender discrimination has been rooting in the society for ages. In the novel, inequality is as infectious as disease, a crippling attitude that kills ambition, crushes women's spirits, and discourages them from supporting and future generations and other female relatives. The women also attempt to break out of the role of domesticity and servility to the surprise of the man. Written as a series of letters by the central protagonist, Sally, and her sister Nettie, this epistolary novel honestly and unflinchingly explores the damaging effects of male domination upon Sally's spirit and her eventual redemption through the love of her husband's mistress, Shark Avery. Breaking the silence surrounding such taboo subjects as incest and lesbianism, The Color Purple both explores the theme of sexual oppression of Black women by Black men and situates its frank treatment of sexism within the Black community. In the context of white racial oppression of Blacks, both in the United States and in Africa, in the period from the turn of the century and the Second World War. Simone de Beauvoir quotes gender as one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. The words such as feminine and masculine explain gender, which describes a set of qualities that are defined or socially constructed in a particular society or culture. Although women play a very important role in a society, but it is the patriarchal thoughts that have always tried to subordinate them and relegate to margins. Sally's very first letter to God indicates the miserable way she falls a victim to sexual advances and the atrocities of a stepfather. I quote, "You better shut up and get used to it." Sophia too feels unloved by Harpo and she does not enjoy being with him anymore. I quote, "You know the worst part," she said. "The worst part is I don't think he noticed. He gets up there and enjoy himself just the same. No matter what I'm thinking, no matter what I feel, it's just him. Hurt feeling don't even seem to enter into it." She snorted. "The fact he can do it like that make me want to kill him." Now, The Color Purple deals with many such issues as feminism, both in Africa and America. Women should gain their recognition as individuals who deserve fair and equal treatment. Male came first before them in both countries, as Albert says. Men supposed to wear the pants. Women are always expected to be soft-hearted, submissive, subordinated, and obedient in the male-dominated society. Sally, in moments of extreme physical pain, transformed herself into a tree. It is a telling example of a Black woman's proximity to the passive and suffering of nature. Shark Avery, Albert's mistress and Sophia, Harpo's wife, gave fresh and encouraging and new perspective to her life. They taught them how to be strong and more self-independent in life. I quote, "You a low-down dog is what's wrong. Say it's time to leave you and enter into the creation, and your dead body just the welcome mat I need." Thus it is seen that the company of Shark Avery, Sophia, and Niti had molded her life drastically from being a simple, sensitive, illiterate, and ignorant woman into a strong, self-reliant, and unwavering figure who could defend and fight against all odds. The solidarity among these fellow women made them stronger to resist themselves from racist and sexist tyranny. Racism in The Color Purple. Racism is one of the elements of post-colonialism, which is the belief that race is a primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produces an inherent superiority of a particular race. Alice Walker attempts to change the condition of the Black people in America through the characters of women in The Color Purple. In The Color Purple, the sense of racism runs throughout the novel, along with the issue of sexism. Sally, the protagonist of the novel, is born to a poor Black store owner. None of her family members was rich, and this extreme poverty in the family is one of the reasons for the exploitation. Even though both Sally and her sister go to school, but they were deprived of adequate fund for higher and better education. They lacked school funding from the mainstream rulers in the South of America. Marriage to Mr. Dash led Sally to stop her education. There was a division between the whites and the Africans in the standard of living. The characters in the novel live in a dilapidated housings in comparison to the whites. They had their own separate schools, churches, and even cemeteries. It's very wrenching to see the plight of the Black characters who were abused, molested, and lacerated by the whites on the grounds of racism. In The Color Purple, the story of Sally's real father is representative of race and color. Assisted by two of his brothers, Sally's father could run his store very well, which led him to gather sufficient money to run the family. On hearing the popularity and prosperity of the Black, particularly Sally's father, the white merchants began to get together and complain that the store took all the Black business away from them. His successful store makes him the victim of racial violence. This class relations motivates the lynching. This lynching of Sally's biological father ruins the social status of her family. However, Sally realizes that it was her stepfather and not her biological father who was abusive and accused of her rapes. Raped by her stepfather reinforces Sally's inferiority as a woman. She has no one to protect her from the abuses that she suffers of. For the Black community, rap is a strong example of oppression that emphasizes racial and gender bias. In the same novel, Sophia bridges a class gap and racial gap between the mayor, his wife, Miss Millie, and their daughter, Eleanor Jane, who desires Sophia's approval for her actions, her marriage, and her own children. Among all the above characters, the incidence of racial discrimination of Sophia is foregrounded in the novel. The mayor's wife is very pleased and impressed by the cleanliness of Sophia's children on encouraging them in the market. Immediately, the mayor's wife proposed Sophia to be her maid, and to the surprise of them, she retorted, "Hell no." The verbal tussle ultimately led them to physical injuries. Because of this incident, she is arrested and put behind the bar. She is even beaten by the whites very badly. This very incident inflicted both physical and mental pain to Sophia Sally, explains it in her letter. I quote, "Why I see Sophia, I don't know why she's still alive. They crack her skull, they crack her ribs, they tear her nose loose on one side, they blind her in one eye. She's swole from head to foot. Her tongue the size of my arm, it stick out between her teeth like a piece of rubber." Sally's letter explains the inhuman treatment given to Sophia by the whites. She is beaten as an animal because she is too black and Mear's family is white. The white ruling class shows no mercy to black women or men. This is how Walker has presented the issues of racial segregation in America. So in conclusion, Alice Walker asserts that the oppression of Black women by their husbands, brothers, lovers, etc., is an outcome of the unnatural hierarchical distinctions. The Color Purple became a controversial novel because of its strong indictment of the racism and sexism that victimized African American women in the rural American South. Yet, it is also the story of the growth and development of the central character from an ignorant, abused teenager to an accomplished woman who has learned to stand up herself and cope with her hostile surroundings. The ending of the novel is astounding and happy, unabashedly sentimental and profound. The Color Purple is a story of redemption and the power of perseverance. Alice Walker doesn't only stop at opening our eyes to the uncivilized aspects of a so-called civilized world, but also shows us how knowledge of the world and people at large, self-awareness and education can help exercise such social evils, how it is never too late to gain a fresh perspective, start anew, and how employment of women eventually can overpower society. Thank you.
Thank you, Benedict, for such a nice presentation. And now I request our DP sir to ask questions. And I also request the viewer who are watching us in YouTube to post the question related to the webinar. And we will just pass the questions to the presenter. Sir, it's to you.
Hello, am I audible?
Okay.
Yes. Yes.
So may I ask her questions? Hello,
Sure,
am I audible?
Sure.
Yeah. So Benedict Di Sangma, thank you very much for your paper, where you have stretched out your ideas on racism, class, gender oppression. So it was very interesting one. So I would just like to ask you one question. How would you perceive Sally in a modern woman? So what's your viewpoint? I just want to know it.
Okay. Thank you so much for your questions, Mrs. Sultana Rizwana Yashmin. Yes, in the novel The Color Purple, there has been a drastic change in the character of the main protagonist, Sally, from being a submissive, powerless, voiceless, joyless character to being a very powerful, independent woman who started owning her own business, who started living her life, who started feeling younger, and who started loving herself. So I think this is an epitome of an independent woman and a modern woman too.
Okay, okay. So I would like to ask you one
Can
more
this be
question.
called a woman? Okay.
I would like to ask you
Sir,
one
it's
more
to you, sir.
question.
Richona, just wait a bit, please. After that,
Okay,
you
sir.
can
Okay,
ask.
Not a problem.
Okay, I was just making a suggestion that whether such a character can be described as a womanist hero, a sort of a character in sort of a Bildungsroman where she ultimately finds her own voice. And a question that I just like to ask to Benedicta is that um, um, in tandem with the previous presentation that we had on the kind of an anxiety that constitutes the male identity. So this violence in the novel that Sally undergoes from the characters, they have sort of post-colonial cultural anxiety, where this violence basically validates their strength, their existence in a sort of a way they have been treated by their erstwhile colonial masters. So, is it that kind of a legacy of violence that perpetuates in the oppression of Shelley, in the oppression of the black women in general, to which Alice Walker also draws sort of attention? Apart from being the story of Shelley, it is also a tale about these men also. I think you will agree.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for the question. Yes, sir, there has been a violence in the life of Sally as well in post-colonial context. Sir, I hope I'm getting the questions right.
Okay, I was actually asking about this locus of this violence that Shelley suffered from the black men. And do you think that it is necessary for black men to be violent in order to assert their post-colonial sexuality or male identity?
Yes, sir, it is necessary. It is necessary, sir, to pose the violence against the woman.
And is it a sort of a colonial legacy and
Yes,
colonial
yes,
and
sir.
imperial legacy?
Yes, sir, it is.
Okay. Otherwise, a nice presentation. If there are more questions, Bashar.
If you have question, please ask now.
Okay, sir. So am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, you are perfectly audible.
Benedicta, I would like to ask you one more question. You have mentioned about Olinka in your paper. So would you please like to elaborate on it?
Okay, thank you so much for the questions. Actually, Olinka is a fictitious, the Olinka are fictitious people which are brought forth by the novelist Alice Walker. So when Neti and her missionary friends set out for a journey, for a 4-day journey, they come across a village which is named as the Olinka village. So it's just a fictitious group of people and village.
Okay, Benedicta, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. And sir, with your permission, we should move to our next paper presenter.
Please, go ahead.
Yes, and the next paper presenter is Sujit Samanto, and the name of his paper is Liberal Feminism in India, Role of Pandit Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. And Sujit Samanto, it's to you. Sujit Samunto, it's to you. Are you here?
Is there any problem? Is the presenter present, or Sujit Samunto is
Actually, he
there?
was there,
I think
sir. Actually,
he is there. I can see
Sir,
Sujit
him.
Samant.
I'm present.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
Yes, sir. Sir, I am
Okay,
Please,
then.
audible.
please. Okay. Okay.
I am audible, sir.
Okay. Perfectly audible. So please go ahead.
Good evening, respected Chairman and Authorizing Secretary Bhaskar sir, and all other participants. My topic is liberal feminism in India, the role of Pandit Ishwarchandra Vidyadhar. We know that this year, 2020, is observed as the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform Action. This Beijing Declaration is happened 1995. They are taking the agenda, the most visionary agenda for human rights and empowerment in the world. But COVID-19 has changed the socio-economic and political scenario in whole the society. So, the feminist movement has been scattered in various dimensions. In this situation, we have to rethink the liberal feminism with a view to a Pandit Ishwarchandra Vidyadhar as presented, as proposed. He as proposed in 19th century in colonial British India. At first, I start a two lines of the poem Maya and Yola in a phenomenon woman. It is the fire in my eyes and place in my teeth and swing in my waist and the joy in my feet. Then we start that. First we say that what is the feminism? There is a various dimension, various angle from definition. It can be described. As per the Oxford University Press explained that feminism is the belief that women should have the same rights and opportunities as men. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, the feminism is the belief the social, economic, and political equality of sexes. In this Oxford Dictionary, right, the belief that women should be allowed the same rights, power, opportunities as men and be treated in the same way. Most liberals in 19th century believed that the power of government can promote as well as to protect the freedom of individuals. But modern liberalism believes the main task of government to remove obstacles, the present individual from living freely or from fully realizing the potential. Such obstacles are poverty, disease, discrimination, and ignorance. This word also endorsed by Gayatri Spivak used the term subaltern for the colonized oppressed people and working class women whose voice has been muted. Vidyadhar gave them voice to his liberal feminist idea and constant mass movement in the British period. If I consider various the literature review, we see that at first you can see the United Nations, the Sustainable Development Goal that was fixed for 2030. There is a various type of the goal we have to achieve in the whole world. At first, I say that five goals are no poverty, zero hungry, good health and well-being, and quality education, and fifth is gender equality. So, there is given a more stress in gender equity. That is the basic pillar of liberal feminism. Planet 50 by 50 step to the gender equality. Remark that government should take known all these issues that holding the girls from attaining their full potential. If we consider the recent that is published from the MHRD, the new education policy 2020, in the chapter Equitable and Inclusive Education Learning for All, they have also endorsed the concept of the gender equality. Particularly, there is a remark that, particularly for socio-economically and disadvantaged groups that have been historically in education, socio-economic disadvantaged groups can be broadly categorized based on gender identity, particularly female, transgender individuals. There is various concepts in favor of the liberal feminism. The Benedict writes that the education in India, past, present, and future, the development of the women education were recognized in the dispatch of 1954, which declared the government advanced aid to women education. Indian leaders like Vidyasagar infused a new spirit in non-official and interested new character in the movement. At first, there I define some important terms such as COVID-19, very popular term, very dangerous in this situation. Right to Education Act 19, this act had given, empowered all the citizens to free and compulsory education up to age of 14 years. State shall ensure this education, but till date we have not achieved the desired goal. Beijing 2020 is already said this earlier. The objective of my study find out the nature of liberal feminism. Second is find out the concept of liberal feminism as proposed by Pandit Vidyasagar in the various activities in 19th century. And last and third is find out the relevance of liberal feminism in its present context. The data is collected from the various writings of Vidyasagar, journals, online sources, and government statistics also. The methodology is that this paper is analytical, historical survey type, finding these after analyzing the data. If we come in the next analysis and findings of the paper, we see that at first the liberal concept it came from various political idea of liberalism. Idea become a political field by influence liberalism like Adam Smith, Tom Paine. Liberalism is political and moral philosophy based on the liberty, consent of the government, and equality before law. The basic assumption, an axiom of liberal feminism, if we consider that, first, we say that liberal feminism believes that women are empowered from birth with equal ability in maintaining the equal status in form of action and choice. It is one type of individualistic theory, but emphasizing given the equal legal and political rights from both sexes of the society. Many feminist thinkers believe that female subordination is rooted in a state of customary and legal constraint that blocks women in turn and success in the public world. It is seen in the various public spheres like academic institutions, workplace, and marketplace. Fourthly, society believes that women are far inferior to men in both their intellectual and physical ability. Women workers are less efficient, they do not work hard, they take more leave, etc. This is a stereotype concept in our society. All forms of discrimination are based according to the liberal feminism. Women should acquire an equal platform to expose their talent, irrespective of creed they children in. If we consider the founder of liberal feminism, first I say that the John Locke, who is called the father of liberalism, the people have rights such as the right of life, liberty, and property that have foundation independent of law in any particular society. He advocated this idea in his book, Two Duties of the Government. Second, Jeremy Bentham, in his writing book, Principle of Moral and Legislation, he originated the philosophy of utilitarian. He established the idea all humans could be evaluated in terms of their utility and meet their usefulness in producing the general condition of human happiness. Then John Stuart Mill, in his book Liberty on the Subjection of Women, 1869, that is published, women inequality and commitment endorsed strongly. Women should have rights related to property and citizenship. And we come at the Mary Club in his vindication of the rights of women, 1872. He endorsed that inequality between men and women exists due to the disparity between their education. He denied that women are by nature pleasure seeking and pleasure giving than men. And he pointed out that patriarchy of opposition. British Freedom, the Feminist Misquit, and Second Stage, two books also endorse this idea of liberal feminism. Now, we come in the point of Pandit Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. In his various activities in 19th century, he also endorsed this idea of the liberal feminism in our India. We all know that this year is the eve of his bicentenary birth year anniversary. I express my heartiest greeting to this great song. Amalesh Tripathi remarked that the Vidyasagar was a traditional modernizer. Vidyasagar was born 26 September 1820 at Bising, a remote village in Hooghly district. After completing his village study, he came to Calcutta and admitted in Sanskrit College for a brilliant performance in Sanskrit literature. He got his title Vidyasagar. In this time, the condition of women in India are just like Victorian women in England. Various social prejudice prevail in the Hindu society. Practice of sati is just abolished. There is no right of education in females. There is no school, and there is a that their girls go to the school and women admitted in the school. But Vidyasagar, besides his school inspector South Bengal, he set up 25 schools in 5 districts in Bengal. Particularly, the schools were for the girls. Second was, in this time there is no alternative system of the girls for schooling. At first, missionary was started for female school, but their motto, their goal is man does not believe their property. There is a conversion also in religion, man thinks. And second, Vidyasagar thought was starting widow remarriage. In 1956, this act was passed. Many various activities like in this time, the Sanskrit college was particularly for Brahmin students. He used to Hindu Shastras to advocate against this law. He first had to decide from Hindu Orthodox. He started to break the law. He started non-Brahmin students in Sanskrit college also. The plight of women deeply touched the heart of Anselm against the all discrimination against practice. He also started the campaign against schooling marriage. So polygamy was not banned by British government, but in his life, he takes the mass movement to stop this polygamy. He also set up a theme and annuity fund for helping the displaced women. And his enormous struggle, the age consent law was passed in the British government, by the British government. Ronjit Sen remarked that original liberalism in his sense different from Western liberalism. Sunni Fatah said Vidyasagar was a temperament towards women as the personal life experience would shape and advocacy of women's rights. Vidyasagar emerged as classical liberalism idea. Next, it comes what is the relevance of liberalism in the present context. If we see that gender gap index, India ranked 108 among 145 countries. The gender inequality index that was framed by United Nations 2010, there is a three dimensions: reproductive health, empowerment, and economic status of women. India is lagging far behind from the other countries. In education attainment, access to primary and higher level of education, India ranks 114. Health and survival outcome life expectancy takes to 147. So we do not achieve the equality male and female. UNICEF also says published a report in marriage in early marriage of India. Then see that the 47% of girls are married before the 18th birthday. If we consider the quality, we know that the quality and population of a country depends on the life expectancy rate, people and literacy rate, and technical education and skill training. If we consider the literacy rate, in last 5 decades, there is a huge gap in male and female literacy rate. Last 2011, total literacy rate is 71, but is the male literacy rate is 80 and female literacy rate is 65.46. The right to education has started all over the India 2009 and it came in the post in the 2010 perspective. But how far we achieve the universalization of education? The GR and NER is not up to the mark of the girls' education. And after the COVID situation, they are very afraid. When the school is reopened, all girls come to our school. The early marriage, unintended pregnancies, and this break make the obstacle to regarding their food if we consider the sex ratio. Though the sex determination banned in our country, but the sex ratio has declined in the last few decades. Now, 2011, the sex ratio is 946. 2020, 924. National Crime Bureau also published a report that there is an increase of the violence against women. This lockdown in COVID-19 make a shadow pandemic among the women. Women and girls are most vulnerable at this position. The liberal principle also argues that the equal opportunities and law by the state, if we consider our constitutional provision, there are various law and law. The Article 14, equality before law and women. Article 15, the state shall not discriminate against any citizen of India on ground of sex. The Article 15, state empowered to make special provisions in favor of children and women. Article 39(1), equal pay for equal work for both men and women. Article 142, the state shall make the provision for keeping just human condition of work and maternity relief. Article 243, D, Section 3, 1/3 of the total number of the seats to be filled by direct election in every panchayat shall be reserved for women. The Women Reservation Bill is still in panchayat level, that is not come in the upper level. Lastly, Article 21A, free and compulsory education to all children of age group 16 to 14. Constitution provides many provisions for equality of women, yet the ideal of liberal feminism is not achieved. The Atmanirbhar Bharat and self-reliant India, if we build so over empowerment of women in their all spheres is needed. COVID-19 and is an opening opportunity in a time. In conclusion, say that we are still living in the liberal feminism era. After 200 years, our society is still fighting against the women's rights in the field of the education, early marriage, reproductive rights, abortion rights, and LGBTQ rights. Due to long lockdown, women are the most vulnerable in the COVID-19 period. Education is nearly 90%. World student population from pre-primary to higher education has been disrupted in a time of interrupted. Even women have estimated 10 million more secondary school age girls will be out of school after the post-COVID-19 period. Are we ready to keep our year and year in the education institution after COVID-19 period? The right to Education Act includes the right to education, but girls are lagging behind in our online learning. There are increased violence against women and present period where we are reaching the idea of liberal feminism as proposed by Sunni Di Sangma in the 19th century. We must at first change ourselves. And society awareness will be developed and deconstructed the patriarchal norm. Academic feminism must be increased in the present society, but activist feminism is more needed. The liberal feminism is the solution of gender equality in our country at present condition. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your informative lecture. Really, it was a very informative one. And now I would like to request all the audiences, if they have any questions, they can write in the chat box in YouTube. And now I request our DP sir to ask any questions regarding this lecture.
So, thanks, Shruti. And this is really a kind of a sweeping presentation of what Vidya Sagar wanted to achieve. I am particularly intrigued about one thing that you have repeatedly used the term liberal feminism. So when we talk about liberal feminism from the point of view of feminist theories, it distinctly has a kind of a westernized history of its own, and we simply can't deny it. So what Vidyasagar did in case of his own country, how does it stand in relation to the other feminist movements or liberal feminist movements that
Yes, sir.
parts of the world? So that is one way. Okay, you can.
Vidyasagar take education as a tool and technique to against establish a female liberal feminism in our India, like the Paulo Freire in Brazil, who is a mass education opposed education. He wanted to mass education, both male and female, and particularly he thought to give the extra stress on the female education. That was the main foundation of the liberal feminism and early stage and the very early stage, the classical stage of the liberal feminism in the history.
Okay, thank you, Shujit. Are there any more questions for you? Bhaskar?
Thank you.
Bhaskar? Bhaskar, are you online or have you got disconnected?
Yes, sir. I am online, sir. I was telling that after presentation, we should move to our next paper presenter. That will be presented by Soumi Mukherjee, and she is pursuing research work in Vidyasagar University, and the title of her research paper is Religion, Politics and Identity Crisis in Colonial and Post-Colonial India, a Freedom in Conflict. And now it's to you.
Good evening, everyone. The title of my paper is Religion, Politics, Identity Crisis in Colonial and Post-Colonial India, A Freedom Incomplete. During the British administration in the colonial India, the administrators deliberately wanted to design all the government policies according to the Western culture on one hand, and on the contrary, it was evident that the obnoxious groupings on the basis of religion, especially caste, class, region, language, were the fundamental basis of any political community. Thus, the famous divide and rule policy was implemented on the Indians since the division became limpid based on their religious identities with clearer solidity and outlines than they had been attributed to in the past. The homogenizing practices of state structure lacked coherence in the process of augmentation of traditional identity, and as a consequence, India's partition came about. Even after 2 decades of independence, when The modernist urban elites operated the political agendas following the norms of modern Western cultures and politics. A large group of people labeled politics in terms of class, caste, region, and religious sentiments and linguistic allegiances. Here, the paper deals with the uprising of such communal elements in Indian politics and how it gave birth to the mobilization of non-urban elites and the poorer strata of the society. Firstly, it is significant to understand that the concept of modernity prevails into contradictory processes and impacts the social identity severely. On one hand, it leads the societal standards to deeper significance of individualization and singularization, where everyone can celebrate uniqueness. On the other hand, the concept of modernity gives birth to the concepts like nationalism and separatism, which signify a more impersonal collective identity of people. The long historical context and sociological theories, including certain variations of Marxism, can connect the process of atomization of individuals and formation of mass society or population in focused language, and modern politics provides the ability to the administrators to govern people as an unaccompanied or homogeneous entity. As a consequence, it develops the mobilization of social groups in service to acquire eminence like war, colonization, etc. Thus, it proves how social and political world can be easily molded. Not only in early Europe, it is still more unconventional and highly inflammatory condition in caste-ridden India in 20th century. The circulation of a belief is that the format of institutional and constructional relations which our society is made of is a result of our own beliefs and actions, of our own complex making. The availability of a proper description that can be imposed on places and candidates and the imagination of the political agency are required to build an identity. Considering feminism, for instance, it was considered to be a mere description 100 years ago, yet with the development of the imagination of feminism, it has become more agentive and socio-political identity with an upheaval. Now the question arises regarding the availability of the descriptive facts. But before the gradual transition of modernity, people hardly had a clear idea about the distribution of groups over territories and of their agentive potential or political identity. These identities are ascribed to the fact-gathering processes about the society and the condition where statistical cognitive representation can be justly articulated in order to be a part of the regular life. The notions of the processes occurred in India is distinctly divergent from the Western culture, but one of the fundamental truths about modernity in India is it is inextricable connection to the political heteronomy. In the colonial introduction of modernity in India, because of the double process of statistical counting and reallocation, the template of identities went through a drastic historic change. Evidently, it impacts several essential characteristics of the way people conceptualize the social world and their position in it. The modern distribution raised a biographical consciousness, a sense of common interest instead of the otherworldliness. With the development of modern science and Western education, people started to feel the difference between the right doings and the wrongdoings, feel the logicality and the basis of contemporary beliefs. Thus, the British governmental institutions created a new kind of belongingness to the groups, where groups are no longer a number of people who happen to coexist for fortuitous reasons, because these groups constitute the necessary substance of socio-political actions and future. Partha Chatterjee says in his Nationalist Thought and the Colonial World that the colonial state is a complicated and peculiar form of modern concept of state system and policies, since the structure bears resemblance to the major administrative and bureaucratic dimensions of the modern European policies. But it was also severely different because it could not generate those dimensions of the political solidarity in colonial India that rising nationalism added to the notion modern state culture in the West. In the Western concept of nationalism and its sanctification through democratic ideas, a more
intense attachment between people and the state could be noticed. Under the colonial influence, exactly the opposite occurred in British India. The state system erratically gave birth to the racism and turbulence instead of the strife of administrators, and the saga continued in terms of class, caste, region, language, even in the post-dependence era. One of the most predominant characteristics of the Western culture is the early entrenchment of individualism, rationalism, autonomous understanding of human personality, liberal language about socio-cultural governance, and the circulation of ontology of political world to the general people. And as a result, the political identity was considered to be a bridge between the individual and the state. And this concept is primarily denoted as civil society by the towering personalities. The colonial administration was shown that the Indian social ontology used to function in a different way. In colonial India, it was the communities or the religious bodies of Hindus and Muslims which formed the primordial and indissoluble units of social structure, and their outward differences along with cultural beliefs, heritage activities, these two communities failed deliberately to exist harmoniously together. The nationalism in India has certainly underrated the capabilities of different traditions to respond to the altered socio-political discourses and historical conditions, and could not adapt the Western culture and modernist ideologies in a liberal manner. But the nationalist ideology constantly pushed forward the potential power of 330 million Indians, resulting in the eventual victory over the British imperialism. One of the several dimensions of this reattribution of identities came out with the process of partition during the independence. Before the British administration, the ordinary people did not imagine themselves to be designed to a design map of collectivities. As a consequence, the incompatibility of the outcomes of British colonial policies, Indian nationalism gave birth to communalism deliberately, since most of the people had no clear perspective how to deal with the religious identities and modern politics without making a coalition. So, their diplomatic ideas, the administrators directly encouraged the religious identifications further to implement the divide and rule policy from the grassroots level to depend the foundation of colonialism, and it generated a large range of diverse responses from the Indians. The Indian National Congress, in its formal agendas at least, contested the argument that despite the identity in India is ineradicably and severely diverse, nationalist opinions and political practices are united. But in reality, it went ironically far beyond the statement. First, the Congress was hardly correlative in nature, and its political discourse happened quite diversely due to its internal differentiation, especially on the matter of religion, language, identity, and state system. A remarkable part of the ideological energy of anti-colonialism arose because of the hot sentiments from the violation of conventional and primordial religious beliefs, and it cannot be denied that the aggressive Hindu communalism dominated a large portion of Congress politics. Here, it becomes essential to annotate that in the pre-colonial society, there were different sorts of standardizing mechanism for social behavior. In that era, one set of policy was created to govern the internal practices of every community. The traditional society witnessed that political power was tied to fortunes of individual rulers and to the hereditary customs as a more perishable thing, and every individual ruler had invented a set of policies either according to their intellect or accompanying the footsteps of the ancestors. Consequently, there was no general rules tied to a state or impending rulers which can be followed up to the indefinite period, and there was no such written forms of rules and regulations, policies or practices and concepts or ideas governing the statutory bodies which are of relative permanence of either constitutional form or treaty-like documents like the European Society. Moreover, formerly in India, more decentralized pattern of collective of collective deliberations was an action where the autonomy of the lower level was granted instead of the homogeneous centralized Western state culture. Official proceedings worked through the dissemination rather than institutionalized forms. The higher authority only intruded in the local disharmony if the policies of the lower level impinged on higher level before or the modern colonialism prevailed in India. But in the British period, the distribution of power politics was deliberately controlled by a single authority, and the autonomy of the lower level administration was completely diminished. Tocqueville clearly recognized by 1835 that the process of concentration of power constituted one of the great threats to liberty of democratic nations. He wrote, among most of the states on the continent of Europe, the central government is not only charged with acting in the name of entire nation, but also with regulating all matters which are general in nature. So, therefore, in Europe, we see the governments, instead of limiting their actions to this immense sphere, constantly move beyond these limits to encroach more and more on the rights of localities and tend to seize control of the direction of all affairs. The British colonial administrative body broadly worked within the framework of an evolutionary and Orientalist ideology of history, which saw Oriental society as fundamentally and essentially different from the Western ones, but simultaneously they expected India to evolve towards the Western state culture under the British influence. This strange combination of concurrence, similarity, and dissimilarity gave birth to the political debates. The ordinary people started feeling that they belonged to an abstract community like of Hindu or Muslim and deserve eminence over the others instead of maintaining one identity, Indian. The incidents of insecurity, disharmony, betrayals, murders, rapes, movements, crimes, and chaos rose in numbers with every passing day without reasons, and thus each community started acting against the other out of imaginary legitimate political resentment. The birth and the development of Muslim League deserve to be mentioned in this regard. Religious differences came to be even more politically salient in the post-colonial India. The incident of partition alone could not tame the political debate which started deliberately under the British influence. The leadership of Mahatma Gandhi need to be mentioned where the religiosity is concerned, since he consciously celebrated the traditional idea of Sarva Dharma Sambhava, or every religious path is equal. Ashish Nandi has discussed his policies in the chapter named The Policies of Secularism and the Recovery of Religious Tolerance, which is included in the book Mirrors of Balance. His concept of ahimsa, which literally means to be without harm, and his non-violence policy was to some extent successful to tame the chaos revolving around the religious beliefs and the political intolerance in India, to unify the ordinary beyond their outward appearances and to provide the mainstream to the backward classes. To elucidate further, by the end of 19th century, India became Britain's biggest cash cow and more specifically world's biggest purchaser of British goods and exports and resource of highly paid employment of British civil servants. India shared the world economy when the British arrived was 23%, and by the time they left India, it was below 4%. So the production of Indian goods were at the stake, or rather almost stopped due to the strict tariffs and taxes. So many people related to the production of Indian goods became unemployed, and the poor people even became poorer due to the oppression and deindustrialization in India. The tribes were killed, looted, and the raw material were exported to strengthen the economy of Victorian England. Before the British period started in India, the autonomous or semi-autonomous rulers of state, known as zamindars or landowners, accept suzerainty from the labourers and peasant classes. In the colonial India, the British rulers aggravated their agony by oppressing more, making a remarkable difference in the social echelons. So the benevolence of Gandhian philosophy to rescue these ill-fated people from the sheer depth is significant in the socio-economic or political history of India. The political concepts and agendas revolved around the historical incidents are different in nature from the attrition of today's politics of electoral power. Many of the fundamental rules of politics in India were intentionally laid down and justified by the reference to crisis conditions of independence and required partition. Jawaharlal Nehru and the first generation political leaders were quite often conscious of the consequences regarding the execution of their plans. Some measures in that context were explicitly meant to be reviewed and modified. However, these ideas and concepts were never taken up for serious popular discussion or consultation. Finally, immediately after the independence of India, there were deeply misleading and inflammatory religious beliefs, especially after the heinous experience of partition riots, and such impulses were not eradicated through the process of secularization. It only changed its nature. Supporters of traditionalist nationalism based on Hindu practices started the war of words and movements in favor of a single nation with single Hinduism culture, and this was inevitably aligned to a particular language, Hindi, which in reality was next to impossible in such a multilingual country. To ask whether the language of the nation would be English or Hindi or any vernacular was again a false hope of taming the issue. Ironically, the fierce traditionalist opposition was led in India in the Western pattern. In the cases of Punjab and Kashmir, there had been an observable distortion. There had been an observable distortion in the democratic policies immediately after the independence, and as a result, the particular states turned into enclaves separated from their general electoral political discourses and constitutional jurisdictions from the rest of the country. When the regional disharmony began to make a serious upheaval, the National Congress, which was at power at the central governmental body, made naive policies of negotiation to retain the eminence in power politics, but ultimately concluded that it was impossible to get a majority in those areas no matter what. It has been observed since the early stages after conquering the power positions in the country, the political parties tend to pay even laser attention for eradicating disputes to bring developments and generally turns towards the coercive measures which blurs the differences between the individuals and the groups and start treating the entire population as a target of punitive measures and rather puppets. Since they were condemned to choose their policies over the regions, since these regions are an integral part of a democratic nation, this turned the regions over an exchange of force between the states and its armed opponents. Soon, it had been replaced by the extremist militant proceedings, violence, and misanthrope. If, in any case, these groups triumph over the opponent to continue their political objectives, it is extremely unlikely that they would ever be able to establish democratic procedures of administration. It becomes important to mention that the minority groups are quickly circumvent in the cases of electoral politics, so they are forced increasingly into desperate isolation. On the contrary, the Hindu communal forces can easily found their faith in so-called democracy, since they expect to be in power position with the support of religious majority. Isolation and suppression of other castes like Muslim and to some extent Sikhs were practiced in a routinized manner with serious consequences, and laws and orders worked as a bail on it. During the time of independence, socialist politicians from the educated upper caste echelons emphasized on constitutional reservations for former lower class or untouchable stratum, but surprisingly, instead of presenting themselves in terms of caste, they appeared only as liberal and sympathetic individuals. Political developments had assumed that with evolution and caste system would fade away, but with the new discourse proved to conceive if the social justice in the disguised caste terms. Hindu people were perplexed among three parallel dimensions of arguments about how to see the reformation of the country, namely communalism mainly led by Savarkar, pluralism mainly led by Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore, and secularism by Nehru concurrently. It cannot be denied that as a community, the Muslim had lost their eminence as a culturally and socially prominent group since they were being detached from the traditional basis in many cases. Ironically, the group which dominated the Indian society once then had to be protected by the social system. Lastly, Hindu communalism and the politics of lower caste mobilization and riots continue to spread instead of peaceful coexistence. The word democracy has a Greek origin. It derives from the word demokrata, where demos means peoples and kratos means rule. So democracy is a governmental structure where people have the authority to choose their governing legislation. Larry Diamond stated in his book, The Spirit of Democracy, the struggle to build free societies throughout the world, that for democratic structures to endure and be worthy of endurance, they must listen to the citizens' voice, engage their participation and tolerate their protests, protect their freedoms and respond to their needs. John Stuart Mill says that democracy tends to make people stand up for themselves more than other forms of governmental administration in his consideration on representative government, and it enhances the autonomy, rationality and morality of the individuals. According to Tocqueville, in democracy, the common people have the power to remove the structure of political world according to their suitability and desires. Usually the concept of democracy is noted as the prime forces that pushes the modernity forward and make it stable, but Tocqueville's concept implied that democracy in a cultural world that is fundamentally separate from the modern Western culture might produce the exact opposite effect. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your nice presentation. And I request DP sir to ask questions. Then after that, I will ask one question that was posted in YouTube chat box. So after DP sir's question, so sir, it's for you.
So many different.
Sir, you are not audible to me.
Hear me now?
Sir, you are not audible. Sir?
Let me as long as your can hear you loud and clear. Yeah. No.
Sir, you are not audible.
I can hear you.
Yes, sir, you are not audible. So I am proceeding with the question that was posted in YouTube chat box. Question was asked by Dr. Ahmed, and is it appropriate to comment?
Sir, can you please repeat again?
Say
now I think I'm good.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
You are audible, sir.
So your presentation is really covers a lot of areas. So it's a lot of questions that come to our mind. Since you have been talking about post-colonial politics of identity in India, I just like to talk about very briefly the indigenous identity in India and how it has been vitiated by the politics of the colonial era, how it has been influenced by the colonial legacy. So, what do you have to say about this indigenous politics? The people, the indigenous people. I hope you can understand who I'm referring to. Not the common middle class urban citizen of India, but rather people who have been denied any citizen rights in the post-colonial times as well as in the pre-independent India as well.
Okay, sir. So the indigenous politics, as I mentioned there, that the power politics was severely prioritized because the indigenous people who came from the outside India and those people who were belonging from the reserved class were actually given the so-called privileges, but that was just like a fail. And in the grassroots level, they were, according to me, they were constantly being looted and being oppressed, and they were just being made the puppets of or the subjects by which the government laid their policies.
Okay, I think that suffices for their abjection, their sufferings, and the way they are still meant to suffer, even in independent India.
Sir, I would like to say that they were also being deprived of their basic fundamental human rights as well.
So you are absolutely right. I think they are definitely deprived of their fundamental human rights. They are not treated as human beings at all. They are labeled as sometimes as the criminal tribes in
Yes,
certain cases. That
yes,
is the very criminality which is writ large on their very community itself. So I'm reminded of Mahashita Devi's writings, of course. Okay, I think we can carry on the discussion at a later date. So we can move ahead. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you, sir.
Nashkar.
For the we have an assistant professor in Fatehpuria College and joined our college last year. And the title of Tapon's paper is Islamization, Approach of Othering, and the Crisis of Identity in Qasim Rashid's The Wrong Kind of Muslim. And Tapon, please begin your lecture.
Thank you, Bhaskar, for your sincere initiation for organizing this grand webinar. Thank you, respected chairperson, for your valuable presence. Sir, am I audible, sir? Bhaskar?
Yes, you are absolutely audible.
Perfectly audible.
Please go ahead.
Okay. My paper titled as Islamization, Process of Othering and Crisis of Identity in Qasim Rashid's The Wrong Kind of Muslims. My paper actually based on the genealogy and historicizing of Islamization and some questions that are arising out of it and the questions around it. Pakistan emerged on 14th August 1947 as an independent state rather than a part of unified British India. Despite the ambition to create a country for the subcontinent Muslim, when Pakistani nation was created, the pluralistic composition of its society was recognized by its founding fathers. But some of them insisted that creating a homeland for Muslims did not entail creating an Islamic state. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who is recognized as Pakistan's great leader, on occasion of his first speech before the members of the Constituent Assembly of Pakistan in 1947, clearly declared that non-Muslims would be equal rights in the new country, and that every person living in the country has an equal citizenship, irrespective of his or her community, caste, color, or faith. Thus, Jinnah pushed for the Muslims of Pakistan to disregard religious distinctions in politics. He reminded his audience, the Constituent Assembly, that Pakistan would assume an independent statehood with the goal of creating a progressive Muslim state based on pure Islamic principles. His rhetoric was one of reconciliation, tolerance, moderation. Despite the inclusive values espoused by its founding fathers, why did Islamization emerge in Pakistan? Because people felt growing excitement as to what would be the ideological basis to commonly define Pakistani nationhood and national identity immediately after independence. So the Pakistani leadership adopted a nation-state policy basing the claim to national identity on the religion of Islam, negating language, ethnicity, culture, history as sound basis for any claims for any social, economical, and political rights. Subsequently, the common sentimental issue Islam was incorporated into Pakistan's first constitution, which established the country as an Islamic republic where its president must be a Muslim and no law can be adopted if not in conformity with the Quran. Islamic identity of Pakistan was not just a religious issue, but it also became a concrete way for Pakistan's leaders to maintain and justify their hold on power. As Pakistan's first generation of leaders faced growing challenges from Bengali, Baloch, Sindhi, Pashto nationalist movements, they found it expedient to appeal to an Islamic national identity as a means of countering the ethnic cultural divisions arising in the country. Throughout Pakistan history, Islam has thus often been instrumentalized for narrow political purposes, and successive leaders contributed to the entrenchment of religion in state and government structures. So what is Islamization? Islamization is a process which involves a gradual transformation of state identity and polity, and to an extent society towards Islam. In the case of Pakistan, the state-sponsored Islamization process in a way organically linked to the basic problem pertaining to the state identity.
Is there any problem, Tapun?
Tapun, are you here? You are not audible.
Is Tapun got disconnected?
No, he is good, but don't know. There network is. Just wait a bit.
Okay. Ask him to join. He is a colleague from your college. And which department?
Yes, sir. I am calling. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I am calling.
From English department or from other department?
No, sir. Department, English department, sir.
English department. Okay.
From Bahrampur, sir.
From Bahrampur. So let him join once again.
Yes, sir, I am calling him. Just wait. So,
Sir, am I audible now?
yes, Papan, you are audible. Please go ahead.
Yes, Nupun. Please go ahead.
Okay, okay. So now let us see the brief history of Islamization and discrimination and marginalization of uh, Pakistani minority group, especially Ahmadiyya community in Pakistan. The building of an secular, inclusive state in Pakistan proved difficult in the face of rising religious fundamentalism. It was much more difficult for the ulema or the religious leadership to respect the freedom of religion. Mostly Pakistani fundamentalists used the platform of excommunication of Ahmadis, members of a thick Muslim community. Obviously, these phrases are within quote. As a pretext to maintain their hegemony, they used Pakistan's constitution as their political weapon of choice. In March 1949, the first Constituent Assembly of Pakistan introduced the so-called Objectives Resolution, which relied heavily on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, promising that Pakistan's first constitution would make adequate provision for non-Muslims to enjoy for religious freedom. Soon after the objective resolutions was passed into law by Pakistani's General Assembly, the Majlis-e-Ahrar-Islam, a Muslim separatist movement, began to emerge and began to engage in an anti-Ahmadi agitation. On May 1st, 1949, Ahrar activists made their first public demand that Ahmadis be declared as non-Muslim minority. They also accused members of Ahmadi community for conspiring with India against Pakistani Sunni population. Increasingly, Muslim fundamentalist groups turned away from their position that the very creation of Pakistan was per se un-Islamic and began to pressure government officials to transform the country into an Islamic theocracy. The leader of this new struggle was Maulana Maududi, head of the Jamaat-e-Islam and Islamic fundamentalist movement. Maududi sought to unify Pakistani Muslims under the common cause of excommunicating Ahmadis from Pakistan. The government's ensuing crackdown on Jamaat-e-Islam resulted in violent demonstration by Maududi's movement against Ahmadis in 1953. Uncle Basir, in The Wrong Kind of Muslim, comments that Maududi, you call him Pakistani's David Duke. Duke is the former head of a KKK, a Christian terrorist organization that yet claims to want peace, merely as at the destruction of non-white heritages. As Duke is the face of modern-day Christian racism, Maududi is the face of modern-day Islamic terrorism. Like anti-Catholic, anti-Black racism in America, Jamaat-e-Islam in Pakistan spread aggressive, hateful propaganda of ethnic conflict between Sunni Muslims and Ahmadi Muslims. By 1954, it became clear that the government was giving ground to the fundamentalism. For the next 2 decades, Ahmadis would face severe attacks on their properties and businesses. The ulema treated Ahmadiyya not only as non-Muslim but also as threat to Islam. The Islamization of Pakistani constitution received its first major push in 1962 when ulema and the Advisory Council for Islamic Ideology added a repugnancy clause to the constitution. That is, no law shall be repugnant to the teachings and requirements of Islam as set out in the Quran and Sunnah, and all existing laws shall be brought into conformity herewith. After a bloody civil war and the separation of Bangladesh from Pakistan in 1971, the National Assembly approved the new constitution in 1973, portion of which embodied the legal and political machinery of the Sharia as espoused by the orthodox religious clergy. The ulema indoctrinated Pakistan's masses, arguing that there was an inherent danger in affording too much political autonomy to religious minorities whose very existence undermined Islamic ideology. Under Bhutto's leadership, Pakistan's parliament introduced Article 260, 3's A and B, which define the term Muslim in Pakistani context and listed groups that were, legally speaking, non-Muslim. Obviously, Ahmadis were declared as non-Muslim. Let us see the Ziaul Haq's era. Especially it is marked by radicalization. The people of Pakistan believed that the reason of East Pakistan separation was also the result of deviation from Islamic principles. The rivals of Bhutto gathered under the banner of Islam. Zia went further in Islamization to secure his position. The Ziaul Haq political era was a mixture of the mullah and military coalition, where Islam was used to justify his rule based on dictatorship. In early 1978, General Muhammad Ziaul Haq pushed through parliament a series of laws that created a separate electorate system for non-Muslims, including Ahmadiyya. Federal Sharia Court was created and given jurisdiction to examine any existing law to ensure that it was not repugnant to Islam. The essential purpose and effect of the two amendments was to establish supremacy of Sharia over the constitution itself. That is to say, questions of constitutional interpretation could only be answered in the line with Sharia's law. Against this background, Qasim Rashid, in Wrong Kind of Muslim, revisits his birth country Pakistan, its history, historical locale, historical accounts through interviews with his uncle Basir, his cousin Daniel. He uncovers many untold and silenced stories of bitter realities and horrifying truth about Ahmadi sect in Pakistan from its birth to near present. He gives account of the fundamental doctrinal difference between Ahmadis and Sunni Muslims. He quotes, "What exactly an Ahmadi Muslim? Simple. Ahmadi Muslims are Muslims who believe in the Messiah, Mirza Ghulam Ahmad of Qadian. I am an Ahmadi Muslim. We believe Ahmad is that Messiah that both Jesus and Muhammad foretold. I offer this for one purpose only, context into why Ahmadi Muslims are so vehemently persecuted. Because of their faith, they are deemed heretical by Orthodox Sunni Muslims. The majority of Sunni Muslims believe that Mirza Ahmad is an apostate who claims himself the status of the last divine prophet. Traditionally, Muslims believe that the Prophet Muhammad is the last prophet to be sent on earth by God, a belief that holds central place among Islamic religious precepts, and any suggestion to the contrary is perceived to be blasphemous. In popular mainstream narratives, however, such internal distinctions are often overlooked, and all Ahmadis collectively refer to Mirzais because followers of Mirza, Qadians from Qadian, and words that have taken over time taken and intensely derogatory connotations. Apart from the above reason of their non-belief in Muhammad, what is the ideological difference between mainstream extremist Sunni Muslims and Ahmadi Muslims? Why Maududi's Islamic doctrine appeal to the nationalistic and political Muslims? Uncle Basir reads a passage aloud. Islam wishes to destroy all states and government anywhere on the face of the earth which are opposed to ideology and program of Islam. Islam requires earth, not just a portion, but the whole planet, because the entire mankind should benefit from ideology. Towards this end, Islam wishes to press into service all forces which can bring about revolution, and a composite term for the use of all these forces is jihad. The objective of the Islamic jihad is to eliminate the rule of an un-Islamic system and establish in its stead an Islamic rule. This ideological apparatus is quite aggressive, possessive, autocratic, and discriminatory in nature. On the other hand, Uncle Basir also reads another quote from the book of Mirza Ghulam Ahmed. A religion which does not inculcate universal compassion is no religion at all. Similarly, a human being without the faculty of compassion is no human being at all. Our God has never discriminated between one people and another. The art created by God provides a common flow for all people alike. So this type of religious ideology is very gentle, inclusive, peaceful one. Now my concern is that how Ahmadi people is represented, and the question whether their marginal voice is suppressed, how far the author's identity is questioned and oscillated. These are to be discussed with the reference to the text. Drawing an analogy with Black people in America, Eurocentric, racial, ethnic, discriminatory scams against Ahmadi sect is explicitly shown by the authors. Mirzai was or is similar to nigger for Black Americans, camel jockey for Muslim Americans. I am one of the lucky ones who have been called a Mirzai, a Qadiani, a camel jockey, and sand nigger. Sometimes the Ahmadi people are dehumanized and lowered to animal level. For example, the line from this book, you need to just stop these wild goose cases after an apostate people. Just be a normal Muslim. What are you doing is wrong. Uncle Basir continued, Ahmed Muslims were seen as nuisance, but certainly not a threat to the establishment. When Mianji, Qasim Rashid's grandfather, raises 3 questions regarding popular Islamic law, I will tell what they said. They said, I am a kafir. They said, I am Mirzai. for even asking those questions. They told me I would burn in hell for questioning my faith. So their fatwa that we are kafirs outside the fold of Islam. It is more regretful that Ahmadi community is compared to filthy animal and to the disease cancer. Ahmadi people are like a disease in the greater body of Pakistani nation. So to retain the sovereign and healthy state and to cure it, the Ahmadi people are supposed to be killable and surgical body parts. So they are constantly persecuted, discriminated, marginalized. When Qasim Rashid visited the burial place, he came to know that the eternal resting place graveyard, which is referred to as heavenly graveyard, is also desecrated and under threat and considered as a place for the vicious. This whole place was under constant threat and had been attacked several times before. Extremists throughout Pakistan's history found ways to desecrate Ahmadi's graves simply because they are Ahmadi. On December 3rd, 2012, extremists destroyed over 120 tombstones in a Lahore cemetery belonging to the Ahmadiyya community. As usual, police did nothing. This is a report that the author mentions in the book. It is also a criminal deed when a non-Muslim Ahmadi is buried in a Muslim graveyard. When even the afterlife of an Ahmadi is not secure, a mullah would file a blasphemy claim or against an Ahmadi buried in a Muslim graveyard. On account of the deceased being an Ahmadi Muslim, the corpse allegedly violated the graveyard sanctity and needed to be removed. How far the extremist or fundamentalist is malicious to the non-Muslims can be visualized in the case of Nobel Prize winner Dr. Salam, who fortunately belonged to Ahmadi community. Dr. Abdus Salam, who gained worldwide fame and popularity, is made to remain silenced and subjugated to the nation state. And in 2012, upon the God's particles discovery, Pakistani media refused to air any coverage that risked giving Dr. Abdus Salam credit on account of his faith and on account of his exploration being anti-Islamic. The government further refused to acknowledge Salam's existence on account of his faith. In the chapter Into the Darkness, it utters the word Muslim was wiped out from the tombstone. How was this possible? Dr. Salam was a national hero, an international icon. I tried to rationalize and could only conclude that extremists snuck in at night and defaced the tomb. But even that didn't make sense. From Pakistan's birth in 1947 until 1974, only 17 Ahmadis were martyred for their faith. In 1974 alone, however, 29 Ahmadis were murdered. Countless more injured, tortured, boycotted, and discriminated against. Many people of Ahmadi, Christian, Hindu community, like the author's family, have been displaced, exiled from their nation. Because in Bhutto and Hawk's time, Pakistan got aggressive sense of nationalism and Islamization because Pakistan lost its East Pakistan. So, in such marginalization of the minority community, contrary to the idea of nation, when a nation is defined as imagined community sharing a bounded space, evoking feelings of belonging, home, and community for the people, In post-colonial nations like Pakistan, certain categories of people, culture, practices are validated and promoted as national at the expense of others. So post-colonial theory is increasingly uncomfortable with the idea and an ideal of nationalism or national identity because it is exclusionary rather than homogenizing in the name of common identity when real differences between people continue to exist. There is certain description as to honoring Ahmadi community in the text. Their religious expression is considered as an act of criminality. Ahmadi leaders who continue to address their congregation in their official capacities were arrested, mosques were tightly policed and shut down. Ahmadi Muslims caught acting Muslim were subject to imprisonment and worse kind of penalty. As religion is always performative and ritualistic, one belonging to Ahmadi community is not allowed to perform his religious identity. There are few instances of massacres incidents in Ahmadi mosque by fundamental terrorist organization in Pakistan mentioned in the text. In a world, Qasim Rashid re-encounters religious, social, and political discrimination, oppression against Ahmadi sect as a minority people in post-colonial era. So these are the outcome of Islamization. Now my question is the process of marginalization and domination of Ahmadi in discursive as well as cohesive ways a replication or return to the British imperialism which functioned through using colonial discourses and cohesions? In this political nation state like Pakistan, women, ethnic, religious minorities become others. The new elite extremist Muslims are dominating and ruling over others. The new elite Orthodox Muslims in Pakistan are as oppressive and exclusive as the colonial master. Islamization, drawing inspiration from Maududi's ideology, functions as a little bit similar as the British imperialism did succeed. So it has its implicit legacy of colonial ideology. So how the author's identity as both Muslim and Ahmadi is gauged and seen in America and in Pakistan during his revisiting his native country? Does he experience same kind of discrimination and suspicion in America and in Pakistan after a few years back to visit Pakistan? Qasim Rashid and his family moved to United States in 1987. The author reflects on his childhood growing up in the United States and bullied for being Muslims. He shares his personal journey of being challenged by Christian co-worker to prove that his belief was right and Rashid's was wrong. Here they face similar, though not as intense, discrimination and suspicion. His identity is, to a greater extent, consolidated and assimilated in American soil. He says, my English does not have a Pakistani accent, but my Urdu has an American accent. Yet his identity is sometimes oscillated when he is identified as a Muslim, equated with Shahzad, who is a product of Islamic terrorist organization by American television anchor. The heartbreak of both worlds is movingly captured in Rashid's memoir, in which he relates not only his own experiences, but those of the many victims he interviewed. I visited blood-splattered mosques, touched scars left by gunfire, grenades, and prayed for the departed at their final resting places. During his visit to Pakistan, after a long time to recount the Pakistani history, the birth of my ancestor, the author is stopped, scrutinized by the Pakistani police. He is now suspected as a terrorist. This suspicion is also already experienced by the author, randomly stopped to be searched in America. He presents himself ostensibly to be an Ahmadi. This time, his identity in American contour is suspected and jilted for being American, not being an Ahmadi. Can the voiceless minority be articulate? In the text, Mianji, Daniel represent freedom of faith, religion, in spite of the oppression by the state. They can stick to their faith even after death threats. Their peaceful religion is celebrated in gentle, peaceful way. It is this kind of silent reply to the majoritarian cultural identity, religious identity. At the end of this text, he gives a solution to the people of Pakistan and all over the world. The antidote, therefore, he writes, is education and compassion. Education combats the ignorance, compassion melts away fear. He denounces the traditional view of jihad as cherished by Islamic fundamentalists who believes in the victory of sword. But being a representative of Ahmadiyya sect as well as being an author emphasizes the jihad of the pen that will be more effective and comprehensive. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Tapon, for such engaging lecture. And now I ask Divi sir to ask questions.
Thank you, Tapon. Your presentation was constantly reminding me of another novel, The Reluctant Fundamentalist by Mohsin Hamid. And the thing that you have really brought to surface, the very existence of the Ahmadiyya community and particularly the plight of an Ahmadiyya Pakistani in US, that how after particularly the 9/11 attacks, that he is in a kind of, in certain way doubly marginalized or doubly oppressed, so as to say.
Yes,
so I just like to go back to one of the ideas that you have mentioned in the course of your paper, is that you have talked about this idea of the two nations, and this is indeed a colonial legacy that you have rightly pointed out, that as just a few days back, Professor Romila Thapar, in a lecture delivered, was actually talking about how it was initially that very influential History of India by James Mill, which for the first time theoretically established India as the very home for the two parallel races, the two nations, so as the Hindus and Muslims. So I think that is indeed a colonial legacy that has vitiated the later post-colonial formations and configurations of our religious as well as the political identity. You have also mentioned the way that the loss of the East Pakistan was actually a kind of a body blow that the Pakistan suffered. And so that was something that changed their way into being so strong supporters of what is called a fundamentalist Muslim attitude. Incidentally, the paradox means all the while apparent, because all the great Muslim leaders who preach this idea of Muslim nationhood based on religion were very much anglicized, and this is once again so you are talking about Qasim Rashid, who is settled in US and who says that his English is far better than the common Pakistani English. So that was true for Jinnah, that was true for say Muhammad Iqbal, who were highly anglicized, and their manners and customs in everyday life. I think you have read that famous and closely to get a kind of a everyday life of the upper class Muslim in Bombay, and that is highly anglicized. And so somewhere there is this question of fundamentalism coming. It is all about power, I think, that resurfaces with the question of a Muslim turning into the path of fundamentalism. Otherwise, in a kind of a normal or rather a kind of a given situation where there are no wants or no crisis, there is absolutely no reason for an anglicized Muslim to cross over to the path of being a fundamentalist. Do you agree with that? I think I have made my comment a bit elaborate one because you have reminded me of so many different things. I just like to make your observations.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for your elaborating my paper and opening a perspective which is new and novel and different perspective. So I will research on this paper from taking suggestions from you, and thank you, sir. And this is my that is my paper's theme and logic, which I elaborated in my paper, and which themes and which logic are supported and endorsed by you is obviously commendable for me.
Okay, thank you very much, Tapun. Bhaskar, are there any further queries, questions for Tapun?
No, sir. Actually, in truth, there is no question, and with this. Of IQAC of our college, I have gratitude.
So it's almost 9. It's
For
past
you
9, I think.
and for chairing the session,
No,
and I also
but I
have
think you two have been trying on your bandwidth for a long time, so it's better to call it a day. I think you have for tomorrow.
Yes, sir. And stay safe and stay home, sir. And Tapun, we are calling it a day, and we hope to meet tomorrow at 10 a.m. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Good night to everybody for patiently listening, and thank you to all. Thank you to all the presenters for being such.
Thank you, sir, for your presence.
Pleasure is all. Thank you. Good night.